June 4, 1940, 338,000 Allied troops had just been evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk, forced to leave behind every tank, every artillery gun, and every vehicle they had taken into France. The British Expeditionary Force had managed to escape, but only just. They'd left an entire army's worth of equipment scattered across French soil. In Paris, citizens read the headlines and grasped the grim truth: the British were withdrawing, and France now stood alone. Among them was 22-year-old Angus Humbert, an art historian at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, moving quietly through streets that now felt empty and echoing with defeat. The government had already begun discussing a retreat to the south away from the relentless German advance. Her colleagues spoke in hushed tones, uncertain about what the future might hold. Some believed Britain would soon enter negotiations, that Churchill would recognize the futility, make peace, and bring the war to an end. France, they said, had already fought bravely, had sacrificed, and now the struggle was finished. Yet in the cafes, in cramped apartments, in museums and universities, not everyone was speaking of surrender. A few were daring to ask a different question: what if Britain refuses to stop? The German offensive swept through France like a scythe cutting through fields of wheat. In just 6 weeks, the French army, the same force that had withstood the Germans for 4 long years in the previous war, crumbled. Not for lack of courage, 90,000 French soldiers lost their lives resisting the invasion. But the German panzers advanced with unstoppable speed. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies, and the French command, structured for the slow, entrenched warfare of 1914, was unable to adjust to this new, lightning-fast kind of war. By mid-June, German tanks were only 50 miles from Paris. On the roads leading south, nearly 6 million French civilians fled in desperation. They walked for miles, pushing carts, carrying children in suitcases, clinging to whatever belongings they could salvage. German aircraft strafed the long lines of refugees from above. People died in ditches, on the sides of roads, and in open fields. The government evacuated to Bordeaux. The army was in ruins. And in Paris, Angus Humbert stood and watched as German motorcycles roared down the Champs-Élysées on June 14. That night, she wrote in her diary, her hand trembling, not from fear, though fear was present, but from fury, from the realization that something essential had shattered, that the world she once knew had ended, and she no longer understood what would come after. 2 days later, on June 16, Prime Minister Paul Reynaud resigned from his position. He had wanted to continue the fight to relocate the French government to North Africa and carry on the war from the colonies, but his cabinet refused to back him. In his place stepped Marshal Philippe Pétain, 84 years old, the celebrated hero of Verdun. And the very first action Pétain took as France's new leader was to request an armistice from Germany. In London, a 49-year-old French brigadier general named Charles de Gaulle received the devastating news. Just days earlier, he had been appointed Under-Secretary of State for War and was in London, working with Churchill to discuss ongoing military cooperation. Now, his own government had chosen to surrender. A decision lay before him. Churchill, however, had already made his stance unmistakably clear on June 4, when he stood before Parliament following the evacuation at Dunkirk. His voice carried that unmistakable resonance, a deep, thunderous rhythm that could turn words into weapons. "We shall fight on the beaches," he declared. "We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." In France, those who heard about Churchill's speech or read accounts of it in the newspapers reacted in very different ways. Some believed Churchill had lost his mind. Britain was an island, isolated, vulnerable, and without an army to defend itself. Most of its equipment now lay at the bottom of the Channel or abandoned on French soil. How could Britain possibly continue the fight alone? Yet others heard something very different in his words. Angus Humbert heard it. So did a literature professor named Jean Cassot, and a museum director named Boris Fay. What they heard was defiance, the voice of someone who refused to believe the war was finished. On June 17, Marshal Pétain spoke to the French nation over the radio. His voice came through the radio sounding old, weary, and fatherly. "It is with a heavy heart," he said, "that I tell you today we must stop fighting." He described the decision as necessary, even honorable. He claimed he was offering himself, his very person, to France in her time of need. Annis listened to the broadcast from her apartment, and as the words sank in, a chill spread through her chest. This was not an armistice. This was surrender. It was the death of the France she had known. Yet Pétain spoke as if it were an act of courage, as if surrendering could somehow be a noble sacrifice. She thought of Britain then, of Churchill's words echoing across the Channel, and of the fact that somewhere, someone was still saying no. The following day, June 18th, Charles de Gaulle stood inside a BBC studio in London. He had made his decision. He refused to return to France, refused to recognize the armistice. Now, from exile, he was going to speak to his fellow countrymen over the radio, proclaiming that France had not been defeated. His voice was rigid, formal, the voice of a career military officer unaccustomed to broadcasting. Yet his message was unmistakable. The flame of French resistance must not and shall not be extinguished, he declared. No matter what happens, the flame of French resistance must endure. Almost no one in France heard the broadcast. The BBC was not yet widely accessible, and German signal jamming was already beginning. De Gaulle was a relatively unknown junior general, recognized scarcely outside of military circles. His speech should have disappeared into the static, should have been forgotten entirely. Yet it did not vanish. Over the following days and weeks, the message began to circulate. Someone heard it and passed it on. Someone transcribed it. Someone printed it on a secret leaflet. Slowly, people in France, those who felt the same cold fury that Anis experienced, started to understand that they were not alone. In Paris, at the Musée de l'Homme, Anis and her colleagues began to meet clandestinely. They were not soldiers, they were intellectuals, academics, and museum staff. Yet together, they began producing a secret newspaper. They named it Resistance. They wrote articles asserting that France was not defeated, that the war was far from over, and that Britain's refusal to surrender kept hope alive. They turned their eyes to London, not only to de Gaulle himself, but to the undeniable fact that Britain continued to fight, that Churchill had declared no, that somewhere, someone was still standing against the enemy. Boris Vey, the museum's ethnographer, a Russian-born scholar who had chosen to become French, put it plainly during one of their first secret meetings. If the British can fight alone, he said, then we are not alone in refusing to accept this. His hands moved expressively as he spoke, as they always did when he wrestled with an idea. Pétain says, the war is over. Churchill declared that the fight would continue. We choose Churchill, they said. Yet it was never that simple. Nothing in occupied France was ever simple. The armistice was signed on June 22, in the very same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918. Hitler ensured that every detail underscored the humiliation, leaving no question about who held power. The armistice split France in two. The north, including Paris, fell under direct German occupation, while the south was governed by Pétain's Vichy regime, technically unoccupied, yet fully collaborating with Germany. For most French citizens, the summer of 1940 was consumed by the struggle simply to survive. Life in the summer of 1940 revolved around securing food, avoiding the attention of German forces, and attempting to comprehend what existence would look like under occupation. Resistance had not yet become a widespread movement, it existed in individuals and small circles, composed of people who could not reconcile themselves with what had transpired. For many of these individuals, Britain's choice to continue fighting marked the boundary between despair and hope. Jean Cassou, the literature professor, recorded in his diary his experience of listening to the BBC, noting how Churchill's voice pierced the static. He speaks, Cassou wrote, as if defeat is impossible, as if the very notion of surrender is beyond comprehension. And upon hearing that, I remember that it felt utterly incomprehensible, that we had forgotten something fundamental about ourselves, and he was reminding us of it. The BBC became a vital lifeline. People gathered in secrecy to listen, risking arrest if discovered. The Germans had mandated the surrender of all radios, yet many hid theirs, and night after night, they tuned into the BBC French service to hear that the war was not over. These broadcasts were more than just military reports, they were psychological warfare, but not in a cynical sense. They served as reminders that resistance remained possible, that France had not ceased to exist simply because Pétain had surrendered, and that across the Channel, someone still held on to belief. In the southern zone, in the so-called free zone of France under Vichy control, people watched Pétain's government cooperate with the Germans and felt a deep sense of disgust. The Vichy regime promoted what they termed the national revolution, emphasizing traditional values, obedience, and collaboration. Posters appeared everywhere, bearing Pétain's grandfatherly face and slogans about work, family, and the fatherland. Yet in Lyon, Marseille, and Toulouse, people began forming small resistance groups. At first, it was a communist cell here, a Catholic resistance network there, socialist activists, former military officers who refused to accept defeat. They came from different political beliefs and diverse backgrounds, but they all shared a single conviction. They were convinced that the war was far from over, and their eyes turned toward Britain for hope. Lucy Ora, a young teacher in Lyon, listened to the BBC broadcasts alongside her husband, Raymond. They heard Churchill's stirring speeches, de Gaulle's urgent appeals, and reports of the Battle of Britain commencing in July. German planes attacked Britain, attempting to force its surrender, but Britain fought back relentlessly. Every night they refused to surrender, Lucy told Raymond, is another night proving Pétain was wrong. She was 28, teaching history to teenagers who had been told that France's defeat was unavoidable and that collaboration was the sensible choice. Yet each night, the BBC delivered a very different story. The Battle of Britain became a powerful emblem. In September 1940, as German bombers darkened the skies over London and the Luftwaffe sought to shatter British morale through relentless terror, French resistors listened intently to the reports. They learned of the RAF's determined defense, of British civilians enduring the Blitz, and of Churchill's government rejecting every suggestion of negotiation. Angus Humbert recorded in her diary, "London burns, and yet does not surrender. Paris surrendered without burning. What does that reveal about us? What does that reveal about them?" Their admiration was nuanced. Some resistors felt a sense of shame that Britain continued to fight while France had already capitulated. Some felt anger toward Britain for retreating at Dunkirk, for not doing more to support France. Others felt abandoned. Yet beneath all of these emotions lay a deeper truth, the acknowledgement that Britain's defiance gave purpose to their own resistance. If Britain had negotiated after Dunkirk, if Churchill had accepted Hitler's peace offers, then the resistors in France would have been struggling in vain. There would have been no Allied power remaining, no hope of liberation, no meaning to their fight. They would have been completely alone. But Britain continued the fight, and that ensured that resistance was not futile. It signified that there was still a war worth winning. By the end of 1940, the Musea dell'Uomo network was operating at full capacity. They published their clandestine newspaper. They assisted Allied soldiers in escaping. They collected intelligence. The Gestapo was relentlessly pursuing them. They were fully aware of the dangers. Several members had grown anxious, discussing the possibility of stopping, convinced the risks were too great. Boris VE countered their doubts, saying, "The British didn't stop when it was perilous. They didn't stop when it was reasonable to stop. Neither do we." In December 1940, the Gestapo captured the first members of the network. By February 1941, Angus Humbert, Boris VE, and most of the others had been arrested. Their capture came as a result of betrayal from someone within their own circle, someone who had spoken. They were all, each in their own way, following Britain's lead, the example of refusing to yield when everyone else assumed surrender was unavoidable. Jean Moulin, who would become the great unifier of the French resistance, escaped to London in September 1941. There, he met with de Gaulle, British intelligence officers, and the Special Operations Executive. He reported on the resistance networks operating in France, emphasizing the urgent need for coordination, supplies, and support. And he revealed something crucial: Britain's refusal to surrender had served as the psychological cornerstone of French resistance. Without that example, without that proof that defiance was achievable, the resistance might never have emerged. Churchill's government, through the Special Operations Executive, SOE, began delivering supplies into France: arms, explosives, radios, and money. British and Free French agents parachuted in to assist in organizing the resistance networks. What had begun as scattered, isolated groups gradually transformed into a true underground army. Yet it all started with individuals like Anissaire, Boris VE, and Jean Cassou, who, upon hearing Churchill declare, "We shall never surrender," resolved that they too would refuse to yield. The relationship between de Gaulle and Churchill, however, was far from simple. De Gaulle was famously prickly, fiercely proud, and unwavering in his insistence on French sovereignty and national dignity. Churchill found de Gaulle profoundly frustrating, once remarking that the heaviest burden he bore was the burden of Lorraine, de Gaulle's emblematic cross. The British and Free French were constantly at odds over strategy, politics, and France's role in the war. Yet for the resistors within France, these political disputes mattered far less than one undeniable truth: Britain was still fighting. London served as their guiding light, and the BBC's broadcasts pierced through the enemy propaganda, reaffirming that resistance remained possible. By 1942, the resistance was actively engaging in sabotage missions, gathering critical intelligence, and aiding the escape of Allied airmen. By 1943, the resistors were actively preparing for the liberation of France, coordinating closely with Allied command. By 1944, when the Allies executed the Normandy landings, the resistance mobilized throughout the country, sabotaging railways, ambushing German units, and liberating towns ahead of the advancing Allied forces. Lucy Ora, who had listened to the BBC broadcasts in Lyon, emerged as a prominent resistance organizer. She took part in operations, aided prisoners in escaping, and helped them survive the war. After the liberation, she documented those early days, recalling how hearing Churchill's speeches instilled the belief that resistance was possible. "We needed someone to show us that defeat could be refused," she wrote. She added, "Pétain told us to accept. Churchill commanded Britain to keep fighting, and we made the choice to believe in Churchill." Ains Humbert barely survived the camps. She was liberated by Soviet forces in April 1945, weighing only 78 pounds, her health completely ravaged. She returned to France and documented her experiences in her memoir Resistance, detailing those early days at the Musée d'Elm. She recounted the moment she learned of Churchill's "We shall fight on the beaches" speech, describing how it felt to realize that someone, somewhere, was refusing to accept the world that Pétain was imposing. That very act of defiance gave her the strength and courage to refuse as well. "They had told us the war was over." She wrote, "Britain said the war was not over. We chose to believe Britain, and we were correct." The French resistance was not born solely from Britain's refusal to surrender. It was forged by French citizens who made the conscious decision to resist, who risked everything, who fought and died for the liberation of their country. The bravery was theirs, the sacrifices were theirs. Yet Britain's determination to continue fighting after Dunkirk, Churchill's speeches, and the simple fact that London kept broadcasting, kept resisting, and kept saying no, provided those resistors with something vital: proof that resistance was possible, evidence that defiance could succeed, and hope that they were not alone. In June 1940, as France collapsed, as Pétain surrendered, and as German tanks rolled through Paris, the future appeared grim. Most people believed the war was finished, that Hitler had triumphed, and that the only question remaining was what terms Britain would accept. Yet Churchill refused. Britain continued to fight. And in France, those who could not accept surrender heard that resolute no and thought, "We can refuse, too." They paid a terrible price for it. The Gestapo arrested thousands of resistors. Many were tortured, executed, or sent to camps. The resistance lost individuals like Boris V.E., executed at Mont Valérien, like Jean Moulin, tortured to death by Klaus Barbie, and countless others whose names remain unknown, who perished in cellars, camps, and forests. Yet in the end, they prevailed. France was eventually freed. The resistance played an essential role in that liberation, from sabotaging German forces to rising up when the Allies landed. And it all began with individuals who heard that Britain refused to surrender and decided they could refuse as well. 75 years later, it is easy to forget just how impossible the situation seemed in June 1940, how logical surrender appeared, and how insane continuing the fight seemed. Britain stood alone. Its army had been evacuated, yet defeated. Its cities faced imminent bombing. Its survival was uncertain. The resistors in France were even more isolated, operating deep within occupied territory. Encircled by German forces and relentlessly hunted by the Gestapo, with no army, no weapons, and no external support, they relied solely on their unwavering conviction that surrender was unacceptable. They turned their eyes to London, to Churchill's voice on the BBC, to the undeniable reality that Britain was still fighting, and from that they drew the courage to resist. Later, when Ains Humbert was captured and interrogated by the Gestapo, they demanded to know why she had acted, why she had risked everything for what seemed a hopeless cause. France had surrendered. Germany had triumphed. Why could she not accept the truth? She explained that she had listened to the BBC, absorbed Churchill's speeches, and seen that Britain had not accepted defeat either, choosing defiance over submission, and that example had given her the strength to do the same. They deported her to a labor camp in Germany. She survived. Britain endured. France was ultimately liberated, and the grim reality the Gestapo had promised proved to be a lie. This was the message of the French resistance when Britain refused to surrender after Dunkirk. They declared, "If Britain can fight, so can we. If Britain can refuse, so can we. If Britain can believe in victory even when it seems impossible, then so can we." They proclaimed, "We are not defeated. We are not finished. We will not surrender." They vowed that the flame of French resistance would not be extinguished. And it never was.